Hello, and welcome to the I Am Barabbas podcast. My name is Reggie Thile, and this week's Bible study will cover Exodus chapter 30 to 34, 1 Kings chapter 18, and 1 Corinthians chapter 8. One of the major themes we'll be exploring in this study is the concept of idolatry, and I also want to focus on what it means to be filled with the Spirit of God. So let's dive in. Now, our first passage is in Exodus chapter 30, verses 11 through 38. If you've been following along, you know that so far we've been looking at Moses and God interacting on Mount Sinai, and God has been giving Moses a bunch of instructions on how to build the tabernacle and all the stuff that goes into it. And so, what we're jumping into now with Exodus chapter 30, verse 11, 38, are the final set of instructions for that tabernacle. Now, the passage opens with verses 12 through 16 with an interesting concept here with a ransom tax. So it says census and ransom money. And so it says every man must pay a ransom for his soul to Adonai when you count them so that no plague will fall upon them. This brought up some interesting study for me. What I learned is that a lot of cultures in those times, including Israel, believed that when you took a census, when you counted the people that you had, it could bring about bad luck or like an evil eye on the population. In other words, you counted your people, and specifically, you counted how many men you had to fight with, and then the gods would come down and deliver a plague or famine or something else to make sure that your numbers would then die down as kind of a punishment for even having a census in the first place. So, with that said, it's interesting to see that in play here in Exodus chapter 30, because normally think about God and think about him being different from all the other gods and superstitions and so on and so forth. But at the very least, it seems like he just understands what these people think and how they may worry about doing a census. And so he's giving them a way to feel better about it. Or it could just be something that's a reality of God, something that he does or something that he did. And so it was something that they had to pay attention to and something they had to deal with. They took a census, if they counted the people, each person, each man that had his life counted for had to pay a certain tax. And that tax was used for the tabernacle. It's interesting as we looked at the beginning of this study, the offerings that were given were supposed to be given from a cheerful heart, someone who's willing to give up the items that God required for the building of the tabernacle. Here we see it as a requirement, as a ransom, as a payment for someone's life, and that money then goes to the tabernacle. So a little different in terms of how the tabernacle is going to be funded from the beginning of this section of studying the tabernacle and everything that goes into it, and now closing it out. I'll say just as an aside, in 2 Samuel chapter 24, if you're wondering about this whole ransom thing, there actually is a story there about David taking a census and then dealing with the consequences of doing so from God. It results in a plague and it kills a bunch of people. And what's even more confusing about it is at the beginning of that story, it says that God was angry with Israel and then he incites David to take the census. And then after they take the census, then God punishes them. So it's still something I'm studying. You can study along with me. If you have any thoughts, ideas, if you've heard sermons or messages on it before, please share with me in the comments. And we can try to figure that out together. But again, in 2 Samuel chapter 24, you read that David takes a census of the people, and as a result, a plague is triggered and a bunch of people died. And so again, in just looking back at our passage here in Exodus 30, the teaching is about how to avoid that kind of thing from happening, and that's to take a tax of a certain amount of money of silver, says half a shekel, for everyone who's over 20 years old. Now, what also came to mind was Matthew chapter 17, verses 24 to 27. Jesus is asked to pay this tax. You can read the story for yourself, but Peter goes and tells Jesus that, hey, these guys want the temple tax from you. Jesus makes a point about him being a son and how he doesn't have to pay a tax, but just to satisfy the requirement, he's going to, and he sends Peter out to go catch a fish that was going to have enough money for himself and Peter to pay the tax. You may remember that story. What was that about? That was about here, Exodus chapter 30, about paying the temple tax. It means they probably took a census and they wanted to avoid the plague, the punishment of not taking the tax for doing so. We move on now to the bronze laver. This is verses 17 to 21. And We've mentioned this before as we looked at all the aspects of the tabernacle, everything that goes into it, altar of incense, the menorah, the Ark of the Covenant, the table of showbread, there's the bronze altar, and then there's the bronze laver. And so there's two items that are made of bronze. It's this laver, which is just a bin to wash your hands with after performing sacrifices. There's blood and everything, so you're washing your hands there. And then there's the bronze altar where the blood is poured out onto. And I haven't mentioned this before, but I thought I'd wait until now to do that. And so why are those two things made of bronze and why is everything else made of gold? Well, those other things that are in the tabernacle, the table of showbread, it's overlaid with gold, altar of incense, the menorah, the candlestick, and the Ark of Covenant, those are all layered with gold because they're incorruptible. They're the most precious kind of metal that existed at that time and still pretty important today. But with bronze, why are we using that for the laver and for the altar? What I've learned is that copper, the metal, is antimicrobial. And so what that means is it releases ions that kill 99.9% of all viruses, bacteria that end up on it. But bronze is a copper alloy. And so God is using bronze in the places where blood is going to be everywhere to make sure that everybody stays clean. Pretty cool, right? I really never knew about that before until recently when I had another study, but that came up. And so that's why, if you ever wonder, that's why bronze is used for the laver and for the altar that the offerings are offered up onto. Now, in verses 22 to 23, we have instructions on how to make anointing oil. Now, in previous passages, we saw what the requirements were for the oil that burned in the candlestick. And that oil was supposed to be pure, clean, unused oil, perfectly good oil, brand new oil, unadulterated oil. But this oil is different. This oil is for the anointing process. Remember, we looked at consecrating garments and the priests and everything else. There was supposed to be oil put on these surfaces to indicate that they've been anointed. They've been set apart for service, for particular service to God. And what does that oil comprise of? Well, it's a kind of perfume. You can see that in verses 22 to 33. We have these different ingredients that are involved. You have myrrh, you have cinnamon, you have sweet calamus, you have cassia, and then you use the pure olive oil also from the sanctuary. You mix that all together. A person who's got a gift of a perfumer is going to do that, and they're going to mix that up, and then that's going to be what is then used for the anointing process. Now, why was this oil perfumed? Well, when it stays behind, it lingers, you can smell it, and you know and you remember, oh yeah, this thing was used for this purpose. So that's the point of having a perfumed anointing oil, to make sure that a mark is left by its presence. We close out with verses 34 to 38. We look at a recipe for incense. And we talked about the altar of incense last week and how the priest would offer up prayers on behalf of the people and himself, and he would burn incense as he did that, and how that was a fragrant aroma to God. We see the recipe for that incense here in verses 34 to 38. You see that it's supposed to be made of these specific spices that are there listed on the screen in the verses that I can't pronounce, so I'm not going to try. And then you had frankincense that was added, and then you had the perfumer add salt to it, and it was supposed to be pure and holy. And this made me think about you and I as now being that fragrant aroma to God as we walk in a manner that's worthy of the calling that we have, as we walk as the Lord Jesus did, according to Ephesians chapter 5, verse 1, we looked at last week, and how in our acts of love like his, we present a fragrant aroma to God, and how we are also salt of the earth and we're supposed to be pure and holy. And so I really see this connection with the altar of incense and the incense that was used to burn and be present and to present that fragrant aroma to God as the prayers are being offering. And so I just feel like you and I, we fit really well into that role as we live out our lives on this earth and we offer up our own lives as living sacrifices to God. He receives it as that fragrant aroma, and we can stay fresh, we can stay pure, and we can stay preserved and last long on this earth, long enough to do his will, because we are salt. Now we're going to look at chapter 31, and what I want to do here is talk about what it means to be filled with the Spirit. So if you've been looking forward to that discussion, here we are, here we go. We start off in verse 1 of chapter 31. It says, Then Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, See, I have called by name Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah. We want to stop there and look at the word called. I have called by name. And what that phrase means, according to scholar Rashi, is to mean to perform a task, because God has called this individual to do something. If we look at a greater breakdown of what this word means in the Hebrew, looking at the Dictionary of Biblical Languages with Semantic Domains in the Hebrew and Old Testament, we see that the word can be broken down as call, summon, to call a person to come into one's presence to give a task. And the idea of summoning someone, especially for God or king or someone with power, or even as a dad who summons his kid into the room, it implies that he's going to give a command or an order. And so what the Hebrew is telling us is that God has said, I have commanded, or I've ordered, I've summoned this particular individual to do a certain thing. And that thing we see in verses 3 and 4 is to make ingenious designs, to forge with gold, silver, and bronze, as well as cutting stones for setting and carving wood, and to work in all manner of craftsmanship. And he's also providing another person as well, Oholiab of Ahisamach, the tribe of Dan, and that they're going to work on this stuff together. Now, what is that all for? If you look at it very plainly, gold, silver, bronze, we just got finished talking about all the stuff that's going to be in the tabernacle, everything from the Ark of the Covenant to the veils to the altar of incense. Then you have that menorah and the table of showbread. Then you have the garments that the priests are going to wear. That's where the cutting of the stones comes into place. Then you have the altars outside, the laver, and everything, all of that stuff. So he's summoned this certain individual, these two individuals, I should say, Oholiab and Bezalel, to come in and to do this work. Now, the question I have is, can these guys do these things already? Like, does God already know they have this skill? Maybe they did this kind of thing when they were slaves in Egypt, and so he's just going to use their previous experience, and that's why he's calling them to do it. We don't really know what this guy's previous experience was, but what we do know is that God is going to also enable him to do such work. And so, in other words, what God is saying here is, I will fill him with my spirit. What does that mean? It means to fill someone, or to give someone the wisdom, ability, and knowledge to perform the task that I've called them to. That's what it means to be filled with the Spirit. So I wanted to break that down even further because it's really important to me to understand what words mean. And so what does it mean to have wisdom, ability, and knowledge? And so I got this together on the screen. You can see a breakdown of the Hebrew words for wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. We have their meanings, their focuses, an example of how they could be used. So what I want to do, though, is start with knowledge, because what I feel like is it kind of makes more sense if we go from knowledge up to wisdom. And so what knowledge is, according to our meanings here in the Hebrew, is a foundational awareness. So familiarity with facts, including moral and divine truths. Now, just practically speaking, that applies to like when you go to college, you go to school, and you're learning facts, you're learning how to do something, you're getting awareness, you're building up a base of knowledge. Like today, my daughter was putting together work and she was adding, subtracting fractions, and she's multiplying them, and you're thinking about this process of learning that she's going through. And a lot of people make the joke like, oh man, all the stuff I did in elementary school I don't use today or whatever. It's not really true. All that stuff that you have done in the past that you learned, it's a base of knowledge that builds up your ability to later do something else. You may not know the exact application of it, but if you learn fractions and you're dividing a cookie and you know there's 4 people, you know how to break the cookie into 4 equal parts so that everybody can have an equal share. You also know how to do 4 parts so that one of those parts are bigger than the other, so that you have a little bit more than the other 3 who get theirs. So you have a basic understanding of what it means to use fractions. And we do that every day of our lives. We have this base of knowledge that we gain throughout kindergarten to 12th grade. And those of you who've gone to college and then you go into master's programs, you have a doctorate degree, you build and you build and you build and you build. And at some point, though, you do need some practical experience, right? You can't just have the knowledge and then not do anything with it. And that's where understanding comes into play. You have analytical insight. You have discernment between choices. And so if you're having this base of knowledge and then you're going out into the world and you're trying to apply it, you have to then know, okay, I have so many options. I have 2, 3 options of what I want to do. And where am I going to go? How am I going to do it? What am I going to choose? For example, with me, I have my degrees in mental health and counseling psychology, my master's degree. And so if I'm meeting with somebody and they've got a particular issue they're going through, I could have instantly 3 or 4 different theories and routes to go with in terms of how to treat this person, how to understand what they're going through, how to explain it to them, then how to apply treatment, and to see how they will improve later on. And so it takes a little bit more experience and analytical insight to decide then which method I'm going to go with. I can have all the knowledge, but exactly which choice am I going to make? I need to have knowledge of that as well. In other words, which one's best for this person. And it's a combination of a bunch of different factors. Then finally, you have wisdom. And wisdom is the skillful application of that knowledge. So I can analyze it. Now, how am I going to apply it to this particular individual? You don't want to do cookie cutter treatments for anybody. You want to know, okay, I'm going to do some cognitive behavioral therapy with this person. I feel like this is going to be the best out of all the theories I have available to me to help this person with their issue. But now, how am I going to specifically apply that theory to this person? Because not every technique and every method may work well for everybody. And so we see that wisdom is practical execution. And so we have an example here as well: a scholar, student, or person who's got deep familiarity with a subject, a problem solver, or someone who connects with deeper meaning. So that's the change from knowledge to understanding. And then you have the wisdom, an experienced craftsman or a wise decision maker. And so that's what it means to be filled with the Spirit. It means to have wisdom, understanding, and knowledge to perform a task that God has summoned you to. Now, naturally, the question from there should be, well, what has God called me to do? Well, that's something you have to answer and ask and figure out. And we study the scriptures to learn, but there are answers there. And once we figure out what God has called us to do, then we can understand what it is He's going to fill us with. What wisdom, what understanding, what knowledge do we need to have to be able to complete the task that He has called us to? And that's what it means to be filled with the Spirit. The reason why I wanted to bring this up and focus on it a little bit and to break it down and explain it is because throughout my lifetime, I've been afraid of the phrase filled with the Spirit, because in my mind, it conjured up images of people dancing and speaking in tongues and other people holding snakes and they're not going to be bitten, and all those extremes of what it means to be filled with the Spirit. I grew up in a tradition that was just like, okay, the filling of the Spirit, the Holy Spirit is more a logical thing. It's more of a mind thing. It's not really just this feeling thing. And I think there's some compromise there in the middle. But whatever all that looks like in terms of physicality and how it's expressed, but whatever it really just looks like on the outside, to me is actually a distraction from the truth. It makes people either think filled with the Spirit is something it's not, when they're all acting out and crazy and stuff like that. And not that the Spirit is there and doing that kind of thing. There are instances in the Old Testament where we see prophets are full of vigor and they're worshiping and they're dancing, and David danced and all that kind of stuff. Sure, that's there, but that doesn't mean that they were filled with the Spirit necessarily. Being filled with the Spirit, again, is to have the wisdom and the understanding and the knowledge or the ability. There's a lot of synonyms being used here, but it's all of that combined to do a specific task. For this specific individual, he was going to be filled with the knowledge of the materials. He's going to know what bronze is for. He's going to know what gold is for. He's going to know what all those things can be used for and how they can be put together. Then he's going to have the knowledge of exactly how to analyze situation and what's the best way to organize the workday to make sure things are done on time and how things should be done. And then the wisdom, he has the practical application with the experience, and the Spirit of God gives him that experience, because remember, the Spirit of God has done this already in the tabernacle in heaven. And that's where the knowledge and that's where the understanding and that's where the wisdom comes from the Spirit of God who has already made these things. That's really the point here. God has already done this thing. And so I want you to make it according to how I've already done it. Now, how is that going to be done? Well, I'll give you my Spirit so that you have the exact base knowledge, the exact understanding and wisdom to do it the way that I've already done it. That, again, is what it means to be filled with the Spirit. A very simple, basic explanation for sure. not going into any kind of nuance or anything else, but just wanting to understand what it actually means in a scriptural sense. Now, the rest of chapter 31 just closes out this narrative of God being with Moses on Mount Sinai. We see that the Sabbath is something that God says will make people know that I am holy, which is so interesting to me because after doing all of this discussion about the tabernacle and about all the parts of it and every level and layer of having to approach God from the courtyard to the Holy of Holies, and the holy place in between, and just how every step is guarded. And I would think that's the holiness of God, and everybody's going to see that temple, and they're going to know God is holy based on our progression and our approach to God. But no, God's like, no, the way that the people are going to know that I'm holy is going to be by the Sabbath. That's how the people are going to know that I'm a different, set apart God. And it made sense to me the more I thought about it, because the temple eventually became a place where other gods were worshipped anyway. And so the temple and the tabernacle, mainly the temple, Solomon's temple, yeah, it lost its meaning and its place. It profaned his name. But the Sabbath, the idea of keeping the Sabbath and not working really is unique to Judaism, isn't it? Or like at least to the God that we read here in the Bible. This idea that he created the world in 6 days and on the seventh day he rested. And I've been to India, I've been to other places. I mean, everybody works. They work. They don't take days off like that. And to have the Sabbath day off is really what he's saying is going to be the ultimate sign for all the generations, for all the people to know that I'm holy, that I'm a different, set apart God than any other God that they may want to worship. So the chapter closes with Moses receiving the two tablets. They've been written on by the finger of God. They're the testimony of the covenant. And so it's time for Moses to go down back to the people. And that's where we get into the second topic of our discussion, or the second focus, I should say, of our discussion this week, and that's on idolatry. In chapter 32, verse 1, we see the people tell Aaron, "Get up and make us gods who will go before us." Why do they do that? Because Moses has been gone for a while. We know that the second time Moses goes back up into Sinai to get another set of tablets, because when he comes down and he sees all the mess that he's about to see, he's going to break the first two that God gave him. And so the second time when he goes back up there to get the second set, we know that he stays 40 days and 40 nights up there and he's fasting. There's no bread, no water for him. It's assumed that the first visit up there on the mountain was the same amount of time. It is assumed that. Okay. And I don't have any other reason why not to believe that. And so if that's the case, that's the case. However long it was, if it was 40 days or 40 nights, Moses has been up there for a while, long enough for the people to say, we don't know what's gone on with this guy. We don't know where he is. The man that brought us out of the land is gone. And so what we need is the God who brought us out to be before us. I want you to understand that. They think the man who led them out is gone or something's happened to him. And so what they want is the God who took them out of Egypt to lead them out of this setting that they're in now, where they're in Sinai, to lead them into the promised land. And so what Aaron does is he says, okay, I'll go ahead and make for you God that's going to be the God that brought you out of Egypt, and I'm going to make you a representation of that God. And so he tells them to take off their gold, the ornaments, all that wealth that they brought from Egypt, and he melts it down. And it says that he clearly fashions it with a chiseling tool with his own hands, which later on he says to Moses, I just threw it in the fire and it came out like that. So the scripture's telling us right here, Aaron is severely compromised. He's lying, because it tells us that he made it with his hands and even used a tool on it. And then he brought it before them. He says, this is your God. This is their God that brought you out of the land of Egypt. So when they see that, they celebrate. And that's what it means by verse 5. It says, when Aaron saw it, when he saw their reaction to what he just made for them and how they were happy and ecstatic to see the God that brought him out of the Egypt, now a representation of that, Aaron makes a proclamation. Says, you know what? Let's make a feast tomorrow for Adonai. And so they woke up in the morning and they started sacrificing burnt offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink, and they rose and they make merry. And the phrase "to make merry" is actually talking about the likelihood that they entered into some sexual practices that were just, like kind of like an orgy, just all together, everybody having fun, is another translation's choice of words there. And all of these actions, whether they want to make a representation of God or not, they're all sinful. Just remember the very first commandment was do not make gods to represent me. Nothing in heaven or nothing on earth or nothing under the earth can represent me, so don't do that. What is interesting is the whole idea of making a calf was that they weren't representing God, but they were representing the seat of God. Apparently, in those times, it was common for cultures to think that gods sat on a bull or sat on a cow, a steed of some kind. And so it's supposed to represent his throne, like the place that he sits. And that's why later on, when Jeroboam, in the split of the two kingdoms, makes two golden calves, he was not saying, okay, we're worshiping actual cows as representations of God. We're worshiping the throne of God because we can't make a image of God himself. We're going to make an image of his throne. It's just a really interesting perspective on the history and the application of what's going on here and just understanding why he chose a calf out of all the animals that exist. Again, it doesn't matter why they did it and their reasoning for it. They are committing grievous sins that violate the covenant that God has made with them and with Moses. Remember in Exodus chapter 24 that people said, yes, we will do as you say, and Moses sprinkled blood and they entered that covenant. And so they are responsible for keeping their end of this deal. So in verses 7 to 14, Moses intercedes. Moses is told by God, listen, the people have gone crazy down there. They're worshiping idols. They're breaking the covenant that I've just set with them. So I'm going to go ahead and destroy them. Moses pleads with God and makes two main arguments. He says, listen, the Egyptians will see what you did, and instead of realizing who you are, they'll see you as something else. In other words, you said in Exodus chapter 9, verse 16, I have let you stand for this reason, speaking to Moses, speaking about Pharaoh, to show you my power and that my name might be proclaimed throughout all the earth. And so Moses is saying, God, remember, you brought your people out of Egypt so that Pharaoh and Egypt and everybody else in the world will know who you are, exactly who you are. And he wants to be known and understood as a God who is going to save his people, who is greater than all the other gods and compassion and kind and all that kind of stuff. And so he says, very logically, God, if you do this, they're going to see you differently. And then his second argument also was to remember the covenant he had with the forefathers, with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and how he would make a great nation out of them. And the truth is that God, in his judgment, said, I'm going to make a nation out of you, Moses. And that would still qualify as making a great seed out of Abraham's seed, because Moses is descendant from Abraham. But Moses, anyway, makes this argument. It's like, remember your covenant to make this people great. And so it says that God hears Moses and he relents from destroying them. That doesn't mean that they're without punishment. And it doesn't mean that God is happy either. We're going to see in the next chapter that God is definitely not happy and that he's actually considering leaving these people. So we continue on here, verses 15 through 20. We see that Moses comes down with the two tablets and they're engraved on both sides. And then Joshua hears this noise coming from the camp and he tells Moses, I think there's war in the camp. And he recites this like actually quite beautiful poem, but it's really sad as well. It's like, it's not the voice of a shout or victory. It's not the voice of crying from defeat, but I hear the sound of singing. It's this really like kind of sad combination of words to indicate to Joshua, yes, we should be worried. Yes, we should be scared. We should be sad, but it's not because you hear war. It's because you hear singing. And what does that singing mean? The people have sinned. And so Moses comes down and it says his anger burned hot and he threw the tablets out of his hand and he smashed them, which God doesn't say like you shouldn't have done that, but feels like he shouldn't have. But it really is also symbolic of the fact that the covenant is broken, isn't it? It's just shattered. The very first four commandments about not creating a God in another image or likeness, they've broken here. Even if they're just depicting the throne of God with this golden calf, it doesn't matter. They've turned this into image of God, his throne. And so Moses then takes that calf, he burns it, he grinds it into powder, he scatters it and makes him drink it. And the only explanation I found for that kind of makes sense is later on in the book of Numbers, there's a test for a woman who's committed adultery. They drink a liquid and then it's to see if the baby that's inside of them lives or dies, kind of like inducing a miscarriage. And if they did commit adultery and the baby that's there is, you know, conceived out of wedlock, then that baby would die, and it shows God's judgment. And that's the idea here, is they're going to drink this water, and then through the drinking of this water, we're going to see God's judgment on the people. And we see that judgment with Moses' actions in the rest of this chapter. He first confronts Aaron about what happened. Aaron tries to explain it. He even makes up that sad excuse, like I mentioned earlier, that is like a magic thing where he threw gold into the fire and a calf came out. Yeah, right, Aaron. He realizes Aaron let them run wild. He calls those who are faithful to Adonai to gather, and who gathers are the sons of Levi. So they come to him, who he's a Levite as well, so its own tribe comes to him. And then he says, every man put on a sword and go and fight and slay his brother. And so in that moment, they killed about 3,000 men. And then he tells them to consecrate their hands because of what they had just done. And then he goes and he tells the people, listen, you committed a horrendous sin. Now I'm going to go up to Adonai and maybe I can make atonement for that sin. And so in the close of the chapter, we see Moses is begging for God to forgive them. And he's saying, please lead us to the place that you promised to lead us. And that's where he's afraid. He's afraid that God is not going to continue this journey with the people. And in doing so, they're not going to be able to survive out in the wilderness, and they're not going to be able to take over the land like God promised. And so he's asking him, please go with us, promise that you're going to go with us. Now, chapter 33 is an interesting chapter. In this chapter, we see that God is kind of done with the people. In verse 2, he says to Moses, yeah, I'll send an angel with you. But in verse 3, I'm not going to keep going with you. Why? Because if I do, I'm going to end up destroying all the people, because these people are stiff-necked. It's just a reference to the fact that they are not able to turn away from the way that they've been going. And so when the people hear these words, they mourn and they don't put on their ornaments, their jewelry. Remember the jewelry, their ornaments, that was their prize from Egypt. And it was also the thing that God said, if you want to give, you can give for the building of the tabernacle. So God was like, hey, you can have that thing. It's your wealth. And it's the thing that they took and they made the idol out of. So it's very, very important to consider that thread, how it continues on. And here in verse 5, God says, listen, you're stiff-necked people. And he orders them then to take off their ornaments. So it's kind of a symbol of freedom. You have your freedom symbolized in these ornaments. You've been redeemed. You've been saved. You've been given freedom from slavery. And there's a symbolic thing you can hold in your hand to say, I'm free. And it's the gold that you have, your jewelry. And with that gold, if you want to give it back to me to building the tabernacle, cool. If not, you can keep it. But I want whoever gives it to give it cheerfully. And then they take the symbol of their freedom and they say, make a god for us with it. And they do that. And now God is saying, take off those symbols of freedom. Just take them off. You can't wear them anymore. And so that's what it says in verse 6. He strips them of their ornaments. Thinks that maybe he collected them and just kept them all for himself for usage later on. So now in verse 7, we see something interesting happening. We see that Moses is still meeting with God at the tent of meeting, but it's happening far away from the camp. And when it happens, the people stand outside of their own tents, watching and looking at Moses until he goes into the tent of meeting. And then when they see the pillar of cloud descend and know that he's speaking with God, then the people would worship. Every man would worship at the entrance of his own tent. And so it's all the opposite of what they were doing when Moses went up into Mount Sinai. Went up to Mount Sinai, the people were like, oh, where's Moses? Where'd he go? They decided to throw their own party and to revel in their freedom. And it led to great sin. Now they want to be reverent. They want to understand God is there. They want to be, just solemn about the whole event, and they want to make sure they don't offend. Would have been helpful if they did that before, but they don't. And then in verse 11, we see that Moses would speak to God face to face, and that God would also talk to Joshua after Moses went back to the camp. And it was after talking to Joshua that he left the tent. And that's pointing forward, foreshadowing to who's going to take over for Moses once Moses dies, and of course Joshua, the son of Nun. Now, verses 15 to 23 are really interesting. We see here what God is talking to Moses about, or really what Moses is talking to God about. Moses is going back to this idea that they're going to enter into the promised land without God's presence, that he's going to send an angel in front of them, but God himself won't be there. Moses is not happy with this conclusion, this decision by God, and so he keeps asking God to change his mind. So finally, Adonai answered Moses in verse 17, I will also do what you have said, for you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by my name. Then Moses says, show me your glory. What is Moses doing? He's like, okay, God just told me he's going to do the thing I'm asking. Awesome. But now he wants proof of it. He wants God's glory to return back to the mountain, or I should say, return back in the way it was at the mountain, that pillar of fire, that cloud. Seeing it at the tent of meeting and being in the Holy of Holies and meeting with God, for Moses, it wasn't the same thing because the people are far off and God's away from the people and it's outside the camp. And it's not the same thing as it was when his presence came down on the mountain the first time and the people saw it and they trembled and they walked backwards because of their fear. Maybe it's not a bad thing, it's not the same thing because at least now the people are being respectful. But Moses wants to have that same experience. For him, that's going to be an assurance that God will indeed be there. Now, what's interesting here is that God responds with, I will show you my goodness. Moses asked for his glory. What is his glory? His glory is like the full weight of the presence and nature of who he is. The goodness of God is a manifestation of his moral attributes as a divine being. It's really interesting. And so he says, I will let you see my goodness. I will let you see a manifestation of my moral attributes. I'll let you see that I'm kind, I'm compassionate, I'm good, I'm perfect, I'm holy, I'm honest, I'm true. I'll let you see that side of me because you are worried that I'm not really going to go with you. And I'll let you see the part of me that'll let you know that I'm a man of my word, a manifestation of his moral attributes. I found that really interesting and I connected it with Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3 says, the Son, speaking of Yeshua, speaking of Jesus, is the radiance of his glory and the imprint of his being, upholding all things by his powerful word. When he made purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. And that translation that says the Son is the radiance of his glory, other translations say he was the full manifestation or expression of God's glory. And it made me think, is that what's happening here? And I'm not the first one to think of this. The whole transfiguration scene, some people thought that that was a kind of point in time, like this nexus of time where all these convergences happen together, where Moses is having this experience specifically with God, where God's goodness is passing by. He's going to put Moses in the cleft of the rock. His glory will pass by, and then he'll cover him with his palm so that he'll just see his goodness, not see his face. And then later in 1 Kings chapter 19, when Elijah hears the whisper of God and he sees God's goodness, but he only sees the backside of God, that in those two moments, that as they're experiencing seeing God, that's also the same moment in time where Jesus is on the Mount of Transfiguration and Moses and Elijah appears and Jesus is transfigured. And so Moses and Elijah, they are seeing the manifestation of the goodness of God. But it's like a time warp where they see it, but it happens later for them, much later in the future. And in Jesus' time, it's happening there in that moment. Really interesting. It's just a theory, it's just an idea. I have no basis of it. We could try to connect some of the terminology and the theology and the wording and all that kind of stuff together. And those of you who've been going along with my study know that I'm not big on trying to find Jesus in the Old Testament, like, oh, this was him, the angel, wrestling with God was Jesus. I'm not sure about that. I don't think the text indicates that kind of thing. But I do think that the text indicates here in this moment that it's very possible, even likely, that this was a manifestation of Yeshua. And of course, God can do that outside of time. He doesn't have to do it after Jesus is born. He's not restricted by that. But it really does make sense if that happens. And anyway, getting back to the passage, it says, he left him in the cleft of the rock. And one of my favorite songs is, he hideth my soul in the cleft of the rock. And so the next time you sing that song, you can remember that it was God putting Moses in a place where he could be protected, and he could also allow Moses to see his goodness without feeling the full weight of his glory on him, which he may not be able to survive. He certainly can't see his face. And just so you know, if you're wondering, it's like earlier it says that God spoke to Moses face to face, and yet here he's like, no one can see my face. And that's just because the phrase face to face is really just used to describe the intimacy that existed between God and Moses. We finally get to our last chapter in Exodus chapter 34. We see in the first 26 verses here that it's all about Moses going back up into the mountain, receiving 2 new tablets so God can write again the terms of the covenant. In verse 28 is where we see Moses was up there fasting 40 days and 40 nights without food or water. Now, I have a personal view on fasting that I think comes from scriptures, derived from scripture, especially texts like Isaiah chapter 58, that fasting is about repentance and that the only person who ever fasted outside of the need for repentance was Yeshua, and that Moses here is fasting the 40 days and 40 nights because he's fasting on behalf of the people that sinned, that Elijah also did this fast for 40 days and 40 nights. And if Jesus is doing it as a fast for repentance, then he's doing it as a fast of repentance for the people, just like Moses did. It's not about his own sin, it's about the sins of the people. It's a fasting for repentance, a sign of contrition. I really believe that, and I understand if people disagree, but I think if you put all the passages of fasting together, the scriptural passages about fasting together, you get a picture of fasting being for repentance. And I know that's controversial because people like to fast and they think, oh, I'm going to receive a blessing, or it's about something else. Don't really see it. It's about repentance and about drawing nearer to God. And that has in itself its own rewards, the drawing nearer to God. So, whatever your views on fasting are, it's fine. But we see in the last few verses of this chapter that Moses' face now shines. He's been with God so much that his face is now become this holy place, and this holy place of God, as God's holiness is literally rubbed off. And so remember, in the tabernacle, we have all of these coverings, these veils that keep the glory of God contained so that people don't see that stuff shining, his glory shining on or from the items that are there. In that same way, Moses needs a veil to cover his face because he's spent so much time in the direct presence of God, which again is a answer to his prayer, which shows God's graciousness in that and doing that for him, because he didn't have to do that for him. He didn't have to show him his glory again, or at least let him see his goodness and to be in that place of light, but he did. But because he did, now Moses' face is giving off that light and that shining nature. And so the people have to be protected from it because now they're seeing it, they're realizing that's the glory of God, and they want to be safe from it because they're still worried about what God might do to them because of their sin. And so he wears that veil to cover his face. And so that's the close of our Torah portion. Now we look at our prophets portion. That's in 1 Kings chapter 18, verses 1 through 39. There's a whole long story here. It's one of those stories you hear in Sunday school. So if you grew up going to Sunday school, you're probably familiar with it, even if you haven't read the Old Testament in a long time. It's a story of Elijah creating this contest between the prophets of Baal and himself to see whose God is real, Baal or God, or maybe even whose God is powerful. What he ends up doing is proving whose God is actually real, but the initial test is definitely about whose God is more powerful. And I was thinking about this and the whole idea of being given a task by God and then given a spirit or a filling of God's spirit to accomplish that task. Remember, it's wisdom, understanding, and ability. So Elijah has been given the calling, he's been summoned by God to be a prophet of God. What does it mean to be a prophet of God? It's to be the voice of God in this world, to go out and tell people exactly what it is that God wants them to know. And a lot of times it has to do with sin and their need to come back to his covenant. Now, in this portion, the nation of Israel has really dived deep into idolatry. Jezebel is the wife of the king Ahab, and Jezebel comes from a place, I believe it's Phoenicia, where they worshipped this god Baal. He's like a storm god. And so in that marriage, they came together and she influenced him to worship her god and to put up altars there and to allow her priests for her god to come into the nation. And Ahab was fine and willing to do all that. And as a result, there was a famine in the land. And it was Elijah who announced this famine was going to start and why and everything else. So Ahab was pretty upset with Elijah, so was Jezebel, and they wanted to kill him, but they could never find him. In chapter 18, he shows up in front of Obadiah. Obadiah is a faithful prophet of God who has hidden other prophets in caves and fed them bread and water and all this stuff. And so he's someone he can trust. And so Elijah shows up in front of him. And so Obadiah's response to seeing Elijah is actually kind of funny because he sees Elijah and he's like, oh, dang it, why are you showing yourself to me? Because now I have to go and tell Ahab that I saw you. because that's his role as being a part of Ahab's entourage. He may be secretly helping other priests and hiding them, prophets hiding them in caves, but as far as Ahab knows, he's loyal to Baal and do their thing. And so he's like, I will have to go tell him I saw Elijah, and then we're going to come back, and you're not going to be here. Why? In verse 12, it says, but as soon as I leave you, the Ruach Adonai, the Spirit of God, may carry you off where I wouldn't know. And so it made me think about how God, with his Spirit, will give wisdom, ability, understanding to complete the tasks at hand. And as a prophet of God in this time, Elijah had to be able to get in and out of places quickly. He literally, if you read the stories, you'll see that he just kind of is at one place and he shows up at the next, and they're all perplexed by it because, like, how did he get from here to there? And it's because the Spirit of God would just take him. And so God, even in that sense, was giving him the ability to be able to, move like the flash and get out of there. And so the Spirit of God was giving him this ability, again, to complete the task that God has called him to. And so it's important to understand that God won't call you, summon you to a task that he won't then empower you to complete. To remember that. And he does that through his Spirit. Now, as the story continues, we don't have time to go into all of that, but going to the verse 39, what we see is that Elijah sets up this confrontation with Ahab and his priests for Baal. And in fact, what he tells Obadiah is, don't worry, I will be here. And to go get Ahab. Ahab comes, and he knows exactly what to say to Ahab to make sure that Ahab doesn't kill him on the spot. He introduces the idea of the contest. And so Ahab hears that. He's like, oh, that's a great idea. We'll go ahead and do this contest. And so they set up these two altars. And again, you may have heard this story in Sunday school growing up or whatever, but just in case someone is listening that hasn't heard it before, what ends up happening is the priests of Baal, they set up their sacrifice, and the contest is whoever's God sends down fire first to consume the offering is going to be the true God. They respond, yeah, it's a good thing. And even all of that, I believe, filling of the Spirit, wisdom, understanding, knowledge. He knew exactly what to say to make sure he can get them to this point where they're going to have this contest. And so they go ahead and they go first. He gives them first choice. You can have first choice of altar, wood, bull, everything. And so they're crying out, and you see in verse 26 that there is no voice. No one is answering. They danced and they leaped around the altar that was made. And so Elijah starts to mock them. He says, shout louder. Maybe he's a god. Maybe he's in deep in thought, or he's relieving himself. He's going to the bathroom, or he's on a journey, or maybe he's taking a nap. And I wanted to point those verses out because it's going to connect to our First Corinthians passage. What ends up happening is they end up cutting themselves because they're really trying to get this God to show up, but he just doesn't show up. In verse 29, you see that there's no voice. And then Elijah just quickly sets up his altar. He has them pour tons of water over. He fills it up with water, actually. So it's like, how's this going to burn? And then he just offers up a simple prayer to God. And again, we talked about this last week. Like, how do we know what to pray, what to say? It's the Spirit of God who does that. It's a filling. It's part of his work. Wisdom, understanding, knowledge, ability. And so he prays this prayer. It's a perfect prayer. It says, Adonai, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel. I am your servant. I've done all things at your word. Answer me, Adonai, answer me, so that these people may know that you, Adonai, are God, and that you have turned their heart back again. And then the fire of Adonai comes down. And then you see in verse 39, it says the people saw it, they fell on their faces, and they said, Adonai, he is God. Adonai, he is God. And so if God's task for Elijah was to be his prophet so that he could turn the people back to him, he gave him, again, a full measure of the Spirit so that he had the fullness to be able to understand, to have wisdom, the ability, knowledge, put it all together to have this moment where God's name is recognized again as being the great God and being the only God, which is something that he needs his people to understand, and something, again, that he tasked a prophet Elijah with. Now, our final passage comes to us from 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 4 through 13. Before we look at the passages, I want to look at some of the historical context. So at this time, first century Roman Empire, animal sacrifices were part of the religious life, and they were a major part of the religious life. And so pagan temples were dedicated to gods like Zeus, Apollo, Artemis, whatever, as places of worship and also places of social and economic activity. I've seen this in India. You have temples that are dedicated to gods. It's also a place where people get together and they have meals and they have programs together. They sing, they watch shows or whatever. It's a lot like how we use our churches today. We have potluck dinners, we have plays, we have special events. It's not just for worship. It's a place of gathering together and doing something together as a community. But as part of idolatrous practices, one portion of what was offered would be burned on the altar, kind of like what would go on with God in the tabernacle. One portion was given to the priests, just like God prescribes in the tabernacle. And then one portion was taken by the worshiper for personal consumption. Now, that wasn't done in the whole tabernacle thing. God says that meat is only for the priests, it's holy for the priests, it's set apart just for them. So with that said, sometimes the worshiper would then take the meat and instead of eating it for themselves, they would go to the marketplace and they would sell it. They would say, oh, this meat was sacrificed to Zeus today. Come and buy this meat, which has been blessed by the priest or whatever, and you can have this meat. I'll give it on sale 2 for $5 or whatever. That was the historical context. What Paul then wanted to address here in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. He says, therefore, concerning the eating of idol sacrifices, he's saying, I know that right now we have a problem in our community where you're going out into these places. You could be going to the temple just to hang out with people and they're offering food and that food's been sacrificed to idols. You could be at the marketplace and you see that there's a piece of meat there and it's the cheapest one, but it's been sacrificed to Apollo or whatever. And so there's issues amongst the community of believers, like, should we eat that meat or not? And there are those who said, no, we shouldn't eat it. And there are those who's like, why not? Why can't we? And the reason why they would feel that way, Paul lays out that reason here in the opening verses. He says that an idol is nothing in the world and there is no God but one. And so what Paul does here in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 is actually declare that idolatry isn't exactly the worship of another God. The sin of idolatry is the worship of the self. It's a worship of me. That's what those people were doing back in Exodus in our Torah portion that we saw. And that's what the people were doing in Elijah's time. They may be thinking in their heads, oh, this is for another God, but ultimately they're doing it for themselves. Why do I give this God this sacrifice? Because I want this God to do this one thing for me. I need to increase my number of sheep. I need to increase the income I'm having over here. I need to have a raise. I need to have good luck. And so when I get up in the morning, I'm going to say, Rabbit, Rabbit Day. I'm going to put one sock on inside out. Superstitions, in other words, superstitions and idolatry and idolatrous practices in worship. Paul is saying that's what that is because there is no God there. So he says in verse 5, therefore, even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, and he's just talking about, maybe the presences of spirits in the heavenly realms, like demons or whatever that want to be worshipped, maybe that exists. Maybe there are people who call themselves gods, just like they say they're lords or whatever. It doesn't matter because for us, there is only one God and Father. And so when it comes to this other God, this idol, even if that is a spirit that someone's worshiping to, I don't need to worry about that and eating that meat because why? There is only one God. And he's the God, the Father of whom all things exist. And there's one Lord, Yeshua the Messiah, through whom all things exist as well. So if you stop reading there, you're like, oh, okay, fine. I'll just go eat the meat. It's no big deal. Let me buy the cheaper meat. Let me go to the temple thing. Let me party. They get a free meal. I'll just eat there and I'm good with it. But that's not exactly what he wanted to address. He's addressing, yes, that's the truth. And that's the way you can take it. But some people are so used to that food actually being part of that idol and the sacrifice to it and everything else, that if they see others partaking, they're weak in their conscience and they're weak in their will and they will be defiled. In other words, they will go ahead and do the thing that they feel is wrong. And in that sense, Paul says we can't do that because we become stumbling blocks to those who are weak. He further says, if his conscience is weak, won't he be emboldened to eat idol sacrifices? For the one who is weak is destroyed by your knowledge. What he's saying is, the person sees you eating the meat. You know that the idol is nothing. You know the meat means nothing. You're just eating meat. You're just enjoying the food. But the person who sees you doing that, they believe in that God. They believe in that idol. They believe in that sacrifice, or at least they used to. And then they went to Jesus, they went to Messiah, and they claimed him to be their God. But when they look at that stuff, they still see it as real. And then when they see you do it, they're like, he's doing it. Maybe I can do it too. because there's always a part of us that wants to go home, no matter what that home looked like. For those of us who grow up in terrible homes with alcoholics or whatever, it's so hard sometimes to break free from those patterns and not create a home that has the same kind of thing going on, as much as we hated it growing up. The same thing works for religion and faith and belief systems. We can go on to the next thing, but then as we look at others doing things that are associated with what we used to do, we're like, oh, maybe I could still do that as well. And then it becomes a trap because you stumble and you fall in the grace and favor that you found in the Lord Jesus. And so Paul says it's on the responsibility of the person who has the knowledge to then act out of love. And in fact, that's how the whole passage starts in verse 1. He says, now concerning idol sacrifice, we know we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds. If anyone thinks he knows anything, he doesn't yet know as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, he is known by him. And what Paul is saying here is you can have the knowledge to know that you're free. You can do this thing and it doesn't affect you. You can thank God. Later on, he says, thank God for the food that you have. So you eat this meat, like, thank you, God, for this that you've provided for me. I'm not recognizing Zeus or Apollo or anything else. I'm thanking you. I love you. And so you have that freedom. You have that knowledge. You're going to enjoy that thing. You're not going to have any problems with it. But those who do will see it and they will fall back into a habit of sinning because they will start worshiping these idols, which again is not about worshiping other gods because other gods don't exist. It's about worshiping the self. And that's where God doesn't want us to go, to a place where we end up worshiping ourselves and our own needs. And the reason why we're susceptible to falling back into old patterns, especially when it comes to taking care of ourselves and idolatrous kind of promises that are out there, is because God's system through Yeshua is built on grace. It's built on his work, his atonement. There's really nothing we can do to earn the salvation except the work of God, and that's to believe in the one who he sent. Alrighty, that concludes our study for today. Thank you again for watching. Our next 2 weeks of study will close out the book of Exodus. So I'm looking forward to that. And also looking forward to going into the book of Leviticus. I think we're going to learn a lot there about Yeshua and his sacrifice for us on the cross. Again, thank you for participating by watching. I also ask that you would comment below, like, and subscribe, and share with those people that you know have a like mind in studying the scripture and are dedicated to learning more about who our God is by studying the scripture and in there seeing the insight that can be given, provided by the Spirit of God. Until next time, stay blessed.